High in the Andes Mountains of South America, something extraordinary was happening. Deep within these towering peaks lay the purest silver the world had ever seen. The year was 1581, and 11,000 miles away, the most powerful man on Earth was about to make a decision that would transform global trade forever. The Emperor of China had decreed that his people must now pay their taxes in silver. This single pronouncement created a demand so massive that silver became more valuable than gold in the Chinese Empire. For the first time in human history, a truly global trade network was about to emerge, connecting continents and cultures through the pursuit of this precious metal. Spanish conquistadors had already established control over these South American silver mines, and now they found themselves sitting on what would become the foundation of the world's first global economy. Ships laden with silver began their perilous journey across the Pacific, bound for China's shores. This wasn't just about trade, it was about the birth of a new world order. The Chinese Empire's hunger for silver was insatiable. Unlike other civilizations that coveted gold, China had developed an almost religious devotion to silver. Silver is our gold in Chinese history, as one historian would later observe. This obsession would elevate Chinese emperors to unprecedented heights of power and wealth, making them the architects of global commerce. But this was more than an economic revolution. The silver trade created the world's first multinational corporations, funded the rise of new nations, and established trade routes that connected Boston to Hong Kong, Shanghai to Seville. The Spanish Empire suddenly found itself at the center of a vast network that would reshape civilizations. What made this moment so pivotal was that for the first time, the entire world was linked into one massive commercial web. European merchants, Chinese officials, American traders, and countless others found their destinies intertwined by this gleaming metal. The silver trade didn't just create wealth, it created the template for modern globalization, centuries before the term was even invented. By the 18th century, China had achieved something no empire before or since has managed: complete economic dominance over the known world. Under the reign of Emperor Qianlong, one of history's most celebrated rulers, China wasn't just a major power, it was the power. The emperor himself was fully convinced he was one of the wealthiest men living on Earth, and he was probably right. China's position seemed unassailable. The world desperately wanted Chinese goods, exquisite porcelain that graced European tables, luxurious silks that adorned nobility across continents, and most importantly, tea. China held a complete monopoly on tea production, and this single commodity would prove to be more valuable than armies or navies. Tea wasn't just a beverage, it was an addiction that swept across Europe like wildfire. In Britain particularly, tea consumption reached extraordinary levels. 80% of all tea exported from the port of Canton sailed to British shores, creating a trade relationship that seemed to benefit China enormously. The British were essentially hemorrhaging silver to feed their nation's tea habit. The mechanics of this trade were brilliantly simple from China's perspective. The world paid handsomely for Chinese luxury goods, but they could only pay in the one commodity China truly valued: silver. Since China produced very little silver of its own, this created a perfect economic trap. Foreign merchants had no choice but to bring silver to China's doorstep. Canton became the epicenter of this global trade network, transforming from a small, remote city into one of the world's wealthiest and most cosmopolitan trading hubs. This was truly Canton's golden age, a nexus where people wearing different costumes, speaking different languages, dealt with goods from across the globe. It was perhaps the world's first truly international city. Emperor Qianlong's court reflected this unprecedented prosperity. He built magnificent palaces and expanded China's borders through successful military campaigns into Central Asia. For nearly 50 years on the throne, he presided over what many consider the peak of Chinese civilization, a time when China was not just economically dominant, but culturally supreme, setting standards that the rest of the world aspired to match. In the bustling trading port of Canton, one man separated himself from all others to become what many consider the richest individual in world history. Born in the same year as Napoleon Bonaparte and the Duke of Wellington, this Chinese merchant would prosper during an era of incredible global change. amassing a fortune that dwarfed even the legendary Rothschild family of Europe. His name was Haokua, and despite his modest appearance and small frame, he was an enterprising and daring businessman who navigated the turbulent waters of global finance with remarkable skill. Operating under China's restrictive trade system, foreign merchants were required to conduct all business through a select group of Chinese merchants known as the Hong merchants. Among these 10 or 12 powerful traders, Haokua stood supreme. Haokua's primary business was selling vast quantities of tea to the British East India Company, a trade so profitable and reliable that it generated enormous annual returns. His silver vaults in Canton became legendary, so much so that during the Great Fire of 1822, witnesses reported seeing rivers of molten silver flowing through the streets as his reserves melted in the heat. But Haokua was more than just a successful tea merchant. He was a visionary who understood the importance of diversification and global investment. Recognizing the risks of relying too heavily on British trade, he began forging partnerships with merchants from a newly independent nation that was about to embark on its own remarkable rise. The United States of America. American traders like Warren Delano found in Haokua not just a business partner, but a trusted friend who embodied honor and reliability in an uncertain world. Haokua's influence extended far beyond Canton's warehouses. He lent £10 million to the British East India Company and invested his Chinese silver profits in American railroads, factories, and coal mines. In a remarkable twist of history, much of America's Industrial Revolution was actually funded by this Chinese merchant living in Canton. Warren Delano's grandson would become Franklin Delano Roosevelt, America's longest-serving president, making the Roosevelt family fortune partially built on Chinese silver and Haokua's global investments. It's a reminder that economic globalization and Chinese investment in America is nothing new. It was happening on a massive scale over 2 centuries ago. By 1792, Britain had a serious problem. Despite being the world's first industrialized nation with growing military and economic power, they found themselves in an impossible situation with China. The British were essentially bleeding silver to pay for their enormous tea imports, and they desperately needed to find goods that Chinese consumers would actually want to buy. The solution, they believed, lay in diplomacy. Britain launched one of the most ambitious trade missions in history, led by Lord George Macartney. This wasn't just a diplomatic visit, it was a massive undertaking involving 700 soldiers and servants, 3 ships, interpreters, musicians, and an impressive array of gifts including ornate clocks, musical instruments, and scientific equipment designed to showcase British technological superiority. Macartney's mission had clear objectives that extended far beyond simple trade improvements. The British wanted nothing less than to be recognized as equals by the Chinese Empire, to establish a permanent embassy in Beijing, and most ambitiously, to secure a small tract of ground or detached islands, essentially demanding a piece of China itself for British use. When Macartney finally reached China in July 1793, after almost a year of travel, he found that Emperor Qianlong had moved his court 200 miles north to his summer residence beyond the Great Wall. The emperor, then in his 80s and one of China's greatest rulers, had spent nearly 50 years expanding his empire and achieving tremendous military successes. He was not inclined to view any foreign power as his equal. The meeting itself became a clash of cultures and expectations. Traditional protocol required all ambassadors to perform the kowtow, kneeling and pressing their heads to the floor 9 times. Macartney refused, instead dropping to one knee as he would before his own king. This seemingly small gesture represented a fundamental disagreement about the nature of international relations. Emperor Qianlong's response was swift and dismissive. His letter to King George III contained one of history's most famous rejections. The productions of our empire are manifold and in great abundance, nor do we stand in the least need of the produce of other countries. The mission was a complete failure. Not only did Qianlong reject all British requests, but he issued a stern warning that force would be used if British ships attempted to trade anywhere other than the single port of Canton that was open to them. While British diplomacy had failed spectacularly, trade with China continued to flourish, and Canton remained the beating heart of global commerce. This remarkable city had transformed into what could only be described as the world's first international marketplace, where East truly met West in all its complexity and contradiction. Foreign merchants found themselves confined to a narrow strip of riverside property, just 300 meters long, known as the 13 factories. These weren't factories in the industrial sense, but rather trading houses and residences where Western merchants lived and conducted business under strict Chinese supervision. The buildings had been adapted to suit Western tastes, creating an architectural fusion that reflected the cultural mixing happening within. Life in this golden ghetto was both luxurious and restrictive. Merchants were forbidden from learning Chinese, discouraged from mixing with local people, and all women, even wives, were banned from the trading quarter. Despite these limitations, the foreign community made the best of their situation, creating a vibrant social scene with elaborate dinners, parties, and entertainment that blended Eastern and Western customs. The restrictions extended beyond social life to business operations. All trade had to be conducted through the Hong merchants, and among these powerful intermediaries, Haokua continued to dominate. His relationship with foreign traders went beyond mere commerce. He was known for his extraordinary hospitality, occasionally inviting Western partners to spectacular Chinese banquets featuring delicacies like bird's nest soup, shark fins, and pigeon eggs. Canton had also become a massive workshop for the world, where thousands of skilled craftsmen produced goods specifically adapted for foreign markets. Chinese artisans created silverware that perfectly imitated Western designs, but at a fraction of the cost, mass-produced porcelain painted with exotic scenes that matched European fantasies about China, and developed new techniques that would influence global manufacturing. American merchants like Gideon Nye described the unique atmosphere of Canton, where cultural barriers were constantly being negotiated and overcome. The city represented both the possibilities and the limitations of early globalization, a place where immense fortunes could be made, but only within carefully controlled parameters set by Chinese authorities who remained firmly in charge of the terms of engagement. By the 1820s, Western merchants had finally found a product that Chinese consumers craved as much as Europeans craved tea. Unfortunately, that product was opium, a powerfully addictive drug that would fundamentally alter the relationship between China and the West, and ultimately lead to one of history's most shameful chapters in international trade. Opium smoking had been banned in China since 1813, but prohibition only made the trade more profitable. The numbers tell a staggering story. In 1767, just 1,000 chests of opium were imported into China. By 1838, that figure had exploded to 40,000 chests annually. This wasn't just trade, it was the systematic drug addiction of an entire civilization. The principal players in this illegal trade were the British, who had established massive opium cultivation operations in Bengal, India. Two ambitious Scotsmen, William Jardine and James Matheson, built what would become one of the world's largest multinational corporations on the foundation of drug smuggling. Their innovations were systematic and ruthless. They commissioned fast clipper ships to deliver opium along the Chinese coast and developed sophisticated distribution networks. Remarkably, Jardine and Matheson never considered themselves smugglers. In their view, they were legitimate traders supplying a commodity that Chinese consumers demanded. The actual smuggling was done by Chinese middlemen, allowing the British to maintain the fiction that they were respectable businessmen rather than drug dealers. American merchants, led by Thomas Perkins of Boston, watched enviously as British traders exchanged opium for tea instead of silver. Eventually, Americans joined the trade by sourcing their own opium through Turkey, further expanding the flood of narcotics into China. By the 1830s, the social crisis was undeniable. Millions of Chinese had become addicted to opium, and the drug was taking a terrible toll on the health and productivity of the nation. Even more concerning from the government's perspective, precious silver was now flowing out of China to pay for incoming opium, completely reversing the trade balance that had made China wealthy. The human cost was enormous. Opium addiction affected every level of Chinese society, from court officials who used the drug to relax, to middle-class scholars who whiled away their time in opium parlors, to laborers who took opium to ease the pain of backbreaking work. China was literally being poisoned by its own prosperity. In March 1839, Emperor Daoguang faced a crisis that threatened to destroy China. Opium addiction was ravaging his empire, while silver drained from his treasury to pay for the poison. The emperor's solution was to dispatch his most incorruptible official, Commissioner Lin Zexu, to Canton with unprecedented powers. Lin's approach was both merciful and ruthless. Those who surrendered their opium would face no punishment. Those who refused would face death. Within days, he had arrested over 1,500 Chinese dealers and seized 70,000 opium pipes. But the foreign merchants were Lin's true target. When British traders refused to surrender their opium, Lin took dramatic action. He blocked the Pearl River, cutting off access to Canton, and placed all foreign merchants under house arrest. Even their servants were dismissed, forcing these privileged traders to fend for themselves. Lin's actions would change the course of Chinese history forever. The standoff intensified when Lin held Canton's chief Hong merchant, Hao Kwa, personally responsible for the rampant smuggling that had occurred under his oversight. The man who had once been the richest person in the world now lived under the threat of beheading, subjected to heavy financial assessments and constant scrutiny from Beijing. Under this pressure, the British finally capitulated. They surrendered 20,000 chests of opium worth millions in today's currency. Lin ordered this vast quantity of drugs to be publicly destroyed, mixed with water and salt, and poured into the Pearl River. In a gesture that revealed his humanity, Lin offered a prayer for the fish and aquatic life that would be affected by the sudden influx of narcotics into their environment. Lin followed up this dramatic action with a letter to Queen Victoria, admonishing her for allowing British traders to poison the Chinese people. Writing in traditional Confucian terms, he expected that once this foreign monarch understood the error of her ways, the drug trade would cease. He could not have been more wrong. Instead of compliance, Lin's actions would trigger a war that would fundamentally alter the balance of power between China and the West, ending China's centuries of dominance and beginning what would become known as the Century of Humiliation. The destruction of British opium in 1839 marked a point of no return. What Commissioner Lin intended as a decisive end to the drug trade instead became the spark for a conflict that would demonstrate how dramatically the global balance of power had shifted. The Britain that arrived off China's coast in 1840 was no longer the nation that had sent Lord Macartney to kneel before the Chinese emperor 50 years earlier. The British response was swift and overwhelming. Leading the charge were the very opium merchants whose drugs had been destroyed. William Jardine and James Matheson spearheaded a furious campaign for war, publishing pamphlets and lobbying Parliament with the argument that only military action could solve the China problem. Foreign Minister Lord Palmerston needed little convincing, adopting the rallying cry, "Let us give China a good thrashing and explain ourselves afterwards." When the British fleet reached the Pearl River in June 1840, China appeared ready. The empire had mobilized its defenses along the entire coast, confident in its military preparations. But Chinese officials had no comprehension of how completely the Industrial Revolution had transformed warfare. While China's population was 30 times larger than Britain's, the British government could now raise the same annual revenue as the Chinese emperor. The technological mismatch was devastating. The key British warship, HMS Nemesis, almost single-handedly won the war. As the first iron-hulled, steam-powered warship deployed in combat, it could travel against the wind, maneuver in shallow waters, and deliver precise firepower that Chinese war junks couldn't match. This wasn't just a military defeat. It was a demonstration that technological superiority had fundamentally altered the nature of power. Chinese ports fell one after another under relentless British bombardment. Traditional Chinese naval tactics, developed over centuries of successful warfare, proved utterly inadequate against steam-powered gunboats and modern artillery. The war revealed that all of China's vast population, ancient wisdom, and cultural achievements could not compensate for the technological revolution that had transformed the West. By 1842, China had no choice but to sue for peace. The Treaty of Nanking, signed that year, reflected how completely China's world had changed. Despite its warm diplomatic language, the treaty was essentially a statement that China would now have to do whatever Britain demanded. The emperor, who had once dismissed foreign products as unnecessary, now found himself forced to open 5 ports to British trade, pay massive indemnities, and most humiliatingly of all, cede the island of Hong Kong to British rule in perpetuity. The Treaty of Nanking in 1842 marks one of the most important documents in Chinese history, for it signals the beginning of what became known as the Century of Humiliation, a period when China could no longer decide its own foreign relations and could be ordered how to relate to the outside world. The memory of that humiliation has never gone away and continues to shape Chinese thinking even in the 21st century. For China, the consequences were immediate and devastating. The loss of the Opium War brought to an end the golden age of Canton and spelled the rapid demise of its greatest merchant prince, Hao. The man who had once been the richest person in the world died in 1843, just 1 year after the war's end. His vast fortune dwindled rapidly, and today only the family name survives. His magnificent residence and ornamental gardens have vanished beneath the concrete and steel of modern China. For the victors, however, the Opium War was transformative in the opposite direction. Hong Kong began its spectacular rise from what was initially dismissed as a barren lump of rock to become an integral part of the British Empire and a crucial hub of international trade. At its heart, the business empire of Jardine and Matheson, founded on opium, grew to dominate Asian commerce for generations. But China's humiliation was far from over. The Opium Wars, there would be a second conflict in the 1850s, opened the floodgates for further foreign aggression. The deliberate destruction of the Summer Palace by British and French forces was designed specifically to humiliate and lower the standing of the Qing court. Soon, not just Western powers but also Japan were carving up spheres of influence in Chinese territory. The silver that had once made China the center of world trade had played a profound role in China's loss of that very position. The empire's obsession with silver had made it vulnerable to the opium trade, which reversed the flow of precious metal and ultimately led to military defeat and national humiliation. Many Chinese officials began to fear that their country faced complete extinction as an independent nation. Yet this period of humiliation also planted the seeds of China's eventual resurgence. The memory of being forced to sign unequal treaties, of having foreign powers dictate terms on Chinese soil, of watching the Summer Palace burn, created a determination to restore China to its rightful place in the world. Today, as China once again rises to challenge for global economic supremacy, the lessons of the silver trade and the century of humiliation remain deeply embedded in Chinese strategic thinking. The story of silver's empires reveals how quickly global power can shift, how technology can overturn centuries of dominance, and how economic relationships can reshape the entire world order. From the mines of South America to the trading houses of Canton, from Haoqua's silver vaults to the opium-stained waters of the Pearl River, silver created the first truly global economy, and its legacy continues to influence international relations to this day.